keeping an eye on our planet from space. It's getting incredibly sophisticated these days.
It really is.
We're not just relying on, like, one satellite's view anymore.
Yeah.
Because, well, what if clouds roll in?
Exactly, or the satellite only passes overhead every few days. You miss things.
Right. So you need backup, different ways to see what's happening, and this move towards using all sorts of data, optical, radar, elevation, you name it. That's multi-modality, right?
That's the term, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's crucial. Think about it. Optical gives you that surface view, clear day stuff.
Yeah.
But radar, that can see through clouds, tell you about moisture, texture. Elevation shows the terrain shape.
So you need to weave it all together for the full picture.
Absolutely. To really understand what's going on. The challenge has always been, well, how do you do that effectively?
And that's where our deep dive today comes in. We're looking at TerraMind. It's a brand new, large-scale generative multimodal foundation model built specifically for Earth observation. And here's the really big deal, I think.
Yeah.
It's the first model that can apparently take any type of EO data it knows and generate any other type, any to any.
That's the key innovation, that any-to-any capability. Previous models, they might have been good at combining, say, optical and radar, maybe optical and some map data, but TerraMind aims to go much further. Imagine taking, I don't know, a land use map and getting a realistic-looking radar image out of it, or vice versa.
Wow, okay.
That kind of flexibility, it just opens up so many possibilities, especially when data is missing. Maybe a sensor failed, or it was just too cloudy for the optical satellite that day.
So what's the secret then? How does TerraMind actually pull this off, this kind of data juggling act?
Well, the core idea is this dual-scale pre-training approach they use.
Dual scale?
Yeah. It learns from the data in two ways at the same time. First, it looks at the big picture, right? The high-level relationships between different data types, like understanding the context.
Okay, context.
And second, it zooms right in. It looks at the fine details within each data type, capturing those really small spatial patterns and nuances.
And doing both together early on, that's the key.
That's the idea. By doing this during pre-training, it builds this really rich, fundamental understanding of how all these different Earth observation data types relate to each other, much deeper than previous models, potentially.
Okay, and this is where it gets really interesting for you, the listener. Because it learns these deep connections, TerraMind can do some pretty amazing things, even without specific training for a task.
Precisely. We're talking zero-shot and few-shot applications. Because it has this foundational grasp of EO data, it can tackle new tasks or work with data it hasn't necessarily seen configured that way before with very little or sometimes no extra training.
And then there's this idea they call thinking in modalities, or TIM. It almost sounds like the model is imagining things to help itself.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty good way to put it. During fine-tuning for a specific task, or even just when making a prediction, TerraMind can essentially generate artificial data in other relevant modalities.
Just give itself more context.
Exactly. So say you're trying to map flooded areas just using radar images. TerraMind might internally generate what it thinks a land use map of that area should look like, or maybe an optical view, to help it better figure out where the water is.
So it's filling in the blanks for itself, using its own educated guesses based on everything it learned.
That's the gist of it. And, the results seem to back it up. When they tested TerraMind against the best models out there on standard EO challenges, like the Panja EA benchmark, which is a big deal in the field.
The industry standard, pretty much.
Yeah. TerraMind didn't just compete. It actually came out on top in many cases.
That's huge. And for anyone listening who really wants to dig into the details, the team behind TerraMind is making it all open source, right?
Yes. The dataset they built, TerraMesh, the model weights themselves, the code, it's all going to be available.
Which is fantastic for the community.
Oh, absolutely. It lets everyone build on this, test it, find new ways to use it. That's how the field moves forward.
Okay, let's circle back a bit. This core challenge, bringing together all these different kinds of EO data, why is it so vital?
Well, like we touched on, each sensor, each data type, it tells a different part of the story. Optical is great for seeing surface details, roads, buildings, fields on a clear day.
Right, the clear day caveat.
Exactly. If it's cloudy, optical is blind. But radar, it punches right through clouds. And it tells you different things, ground texture, moisture content, even subtle changes in height sometimes.
And then you add elevation maps, land use.
Precisely. Elevation gives you the topography, the slopes, the valleys. Land use maps tell you if it's a city, a forest, farmland, water. You absolutely need to integrate all these perspectives to get that complete, reliable picture of what's happening.
And there have been attempts before, obviously. It's not a brand new problem.
Oh, definitely not. Remote sensing has a long history of data fusion. People have worked for decades on combining specific pairs. SAR and optical is a classic one. Or optical images from different satellites. Or optical and vector map data.
But these earlier geospatial foundation models, the GFMs, they hadn't quite cracked this truly flexible multimodality that TerraMind is aiming for.
Often, yeah. Many relied on adapting general computer vision architectures. And those are powerful, don't get me wrong, but they weren't always designed with the specific quirks of EO data in mind.
Quirks like?
Well, things like the really different characteristics and noise patterns you get from different sensors, or the need to easily incorporate auxiliary data like land use maps or even expert knowledge. They just weren't built for that heterogeneity from the ground up.
So what's the real leap with TerraMind? What makes it fundamentally different?
I think it's two main things. First, the sheer breadth and diversity of modalities. It handles 9 different types. And second, it's designed from the start for both understanding existing data, classifying things, discriminative tasks, and for generating new data.
And that generation part is key.
Absolutely. As the researchers emphasize, it seems to be the first truly generative model in this space that can produce any of its known modalities from any other combination of inputs. The any-to-any generation. Other models might take multiple inputs, sure, but they can't typically generate across all of them in this flexible way.
Okay, that's a major step. Now, you mentioned the data set that powers this TerraMesh. Tell us about that. It sounds huge.
It is pretty massive. TerraMesh is this custom-built global-scale data set. We're talking around 9 million aligned data samples, each covering the same location, but across those 9 different modalities.
9 million samples. Wow. Where did they get all that data?
They started by building on some well-known existing data sets. There's one called SSL4EOS12, which has multi-signal data good for seeing changes over time, but its coverage isn't global.
Right.
And then there's Major Tom Core, which is global, but mostly represents a single point in time. Both of these provide aligned radar from Sentinel-1 and optical from Sentinel-2.
And what kind of detail are we talking?
The image patches are 264 by 264 pixels, and at the standard 10-meter resolution for Sentinel-2, that covers a decent area on the ground.
Okay, so Sentinel-1 radar, Sentinel-2 optical. That's the base. But you said 9 modalities. What else did they pull in for TerraMesh?
Right, they layered in a lot more. They added yearly Useland cover maps, LULC, from ESRI. These classify the land into 9 types, like forest, water, urban, etc.
Useful context.
Very. And they even enhanced these maps using cloud and ice masks from another source, Sensei V2, just to make sure the classifications are more reliable.
Okay, what else?
Then there's NDVI, the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index.
Yeah.
It's a standard way to measure how green and healthy vegetation is, and they calculated that directly from the Sentinel-2 bands.
Makes sense.
They also included a global digital elevation model, or DEM, from the Copernicus 30-meter dataset, so you get the terrain height information everywhere.
That's a lot of geospatial data already. But you mentioned text and location too.
Yeah, this is pretty cool. They used a powerful vision language model, LLVA Next, to automatically generate text descriptions, captions for the Sentinel-2 RGB images. They fed it map data from Overture maps as well to help.
How good were those auto-generated captions?
It's apparently pretty good. They used a specific prompt to guide the generation, and when human experts checked them, they found most captions didn't have major errors or hallucinations and were reasonably complete in describing the scene.
Interesting. And the location.
Simple geographic coordinates, latitude and longitude, for the center of each image patch. They rounded them a bit and represented them as text strings, which is a common technique.
Okay, so TerraMesh really is multimodal images, indices, maps, elevation, text, location.
Got it. Now, how does TerraMind actually learn from all this? Let's get into the methodology, that dual-scale pre-training.
Right. So the pre-training process happens in 2 main stages. First, they train individual tokenizer models for each of the 9 data types.
Tokenizers, like chopping the data up. Kind of, yeah. Think of them as translators. They learn to convert the raw input data, whether it's an image patch or a piece of text, into a sequence of discrete units called tokens. It's like creating a special vocabulary for each kind of data.
And why do that? What's the benefit of turning everything into tokens?
Several advantages. For the image-like data, Sentinel-1, Sentinel-2, LULC, NDVI, DEM, they use the technique involving autoencoders. These learn to compress the data. Specifically, they use something called finite scalar quantization, FSQ, in the middle part. Yeah,
FSQ.
it helps discretize the representation. So basically, they divide the images into small 16 by 16 pixel patches and convert each patch into a token from a predefined vocabulary, like 16,000 possible tokens for most image types. Then a diffusion decoder learns to reconstruct the original image patch from that token.
Does that actually save space?
Oh yeah, hugely. They mentioned something like a 3000x compression rate for the full 12-channel Sentinel-2 data, makes things much more efficient. And that FSQ thing, it apparently helps make the training process more stable.
Okay, that's for images. What about the text and location data?
For those sequence-like modalities, the captions and the geocoordinates, they used a more standard text tokenizer, similar to what's used in models like BERT. They adapted it slightly, adding special tokens just to represent the coordinate information effectively.
Got it. So, stage 1. Create vocabularies and translators, tokenizers, for all data types.
Yeah.
What happens in stage 2, the main TerraMind pre-training?
This is why the core model learns. They use a transformer architecture, which is very powerful for sequence data, but they adapt it cleverly. The model takes in two kinds of information simultaneously.
The dual scale part.
Exactly. It gets the discrete tokens we just talked about for most modalities, and it gets the original pixel-level data for some key image-like modalities, specifically the Sentinel satellite imagery and the DEM.
How does it handle the raw pixels?
It processes them in small patches, similar to how vision transformers, VITs, work, using linear projections. So in total, they feed it inputs from 6 modalities at the pixel level and 8 modalities at the token level, with some overlap.
Okay, dual inputs, tokens and pixels. Makes sense. How does it actually learn during this stage? What's the training task?
They use a technique called masked modeling, primarily in the token space. It's a bit like doing a fill-in-the-blanks puzzle.
Yeah.
Imagine you take one of those 9 million data samples. You randomly hide, or mask, a portion of the tokens for some of the output modalities you want to predict. Then you give the model a random subset of the remaining input tokens, plus the available pixel-level data, and its job is to predict the original values of those masked tokens.
So it's learning to predict missing information based on what it can see.
Exactly. And they use a mathematical tool, the Dirichlet distribution, to control how much data is masked and how much is provided as input. This forces the model to learn robust relationships, even when lots of data might be missing.
Why this masked approach specifically?
Well, first, it directly trains the model to handle missing modalities, which, as we said, is super common in real-world EO. If a sensor is down, the model has learned to infer what should be there from other available data.
Makes sense.
Second, working with tokens is computationally cheaper than working with raw pixels all the time because tokens are compressed. And third, it forces the model to learn the complex links between image data, map data, text data, all these different types represented as tokens. The actual training goal is like a classification problem for each masked token. Predict the correct token out of the, say, 16,000 possibilities in the vocabulary.
Okay. And the researchers trained a few different flavors of TerraMind.
Yes, 3 main ones mentioned: V1b base, V1L large, and V1b single. They vary in size, number of parameters, the amount of compute used for training, and importantly, how much they use the dual scale features.
So
V1b and V1L both use that dual scale input tokens and pixels for multiple modalities. V1L is just bigger and trained for longer. But V1b single mostly relies on tokens, only using pixel level input for the main Sentinel-2 optical data.
So they can compare the impact of size and that dual scale approach.
Exactly, to see what really makes a difference.
Right. Okay, so after all this pretty intense training, what can TerraMind actually do? Let's talk capability, starting with generating new data. That sounds really powerful.
It is. Because it's learned these deep relationships, it can generate the tokens for any of its 9 modalities, given any combination of the others as input.
And how do you get an image back from tokens?
You use the decoder part of the tokenizer that was trained in stage 1. It knows how to map those predicted tokens back into an image patch. For text or coordinates, it generates the sequence token by token, kind of like how ChatGPT writes text, starting from a special start signal.
And this allows for things like chain generation. What's that?
Yeah. That means you can, say, start with an optical image, use TerraMind to generate a corresponding radar image. Then you could take that generated radar image, maybe along with the original optical, and use it to generate a land use map.
To keep things consistent across layers.
Exactly. It helps maintain consistency. The paper shows some really compelling visual examples, starting from optical or radar or even just elevation data, and generating quite plausible versions of the other modalities.
That really shows it understands the connections. What happens if you give it very little to start with, like just a geographic location?
They tried that too. As you might guess, if you only give it lat-long coordinates, it can generate an image that looks generally plausible for that region. Like, it might generate a desert scene if you give it coordinates in the Sahara.
But maybe not the exact scene that's there right now.
Like, probably not, no. The fine details might be off. It shows that while it can make educated guesses from minimal input, you really need information-rich inputs like actual sensor data to get highly accurate, specific generations.
Makes sense. Input quality matters.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned zero-shot applications. How does being able to generate data help it do tasks it wasn't specifically trained for?
It's because during pre-training, by learning to translate between modalities, it implicitly learns the underlying characteristics of things. It learns what water looks like in optical, in radar, in relation to elevation. It learns the signatures of forests, cities, etc.
So it can recognize them even without explicit labels.
Pretty much. So even if it was never explicitly trained on a dataset labeled water bodies, it can leverage its cross-modal understanding. It might see something in an optical image, check how similar features appear in radar, which it can maybe even generate internally, and conclude, yep, that behaves like water.
And the results were good.
Quite impressive for zero-shot. They showed significant accuracy in mapping water bodies without any task-specific fine-tuning. And importantly, most standard benchmark models just can't do the zero-shot task. They need specific training data.
And it could do geolocalization too, pinpointing location.
Yeah, in a zero-shot way. They did a cool experiment. Ask the model, where is bare land, most likely? The probability map it generated correctly lit up regions like the Sahara, the Middle East, parts of Mexico, places you'd expect lots of bare ground.
That's neat.
And in another test, they gave it a specific optical image tile. The model predicted the highest likelihood for the correct location grid cell and the immediately adjacent cells. This suggests it's using the spatial context learned during pre-training. This image looks like others I saw in this area.
Okay, so zero shot is promising. What about few shot?
Right.
When you have just a tiny bit of labeled data.
Right, maybe just 1 or 5 examples per class. They tested this using one nearest neighbor classification on standard datasets like Eurosat, land use classification, and METR-ML, methane source classification.
And how the TerraMind do?
Remarkably well, actually. It's significantly outperformed other big computer vision models and even specialized EO foundation models in these few-shot scenarios.
What does that imply?
It suggests that the pre-training created a really well-structured latent space, meaning the internal representations TerraMind learned naturally group similar concepts together. Even with just one example, it can find the right neighborhood. They even showed it generalizing well to higher resolution aerial imagery it hadn't seen before.
Interesting. Any difference between the TerraMind versions here?
Yeah, one interesting finding was that the base version, V1B, sometimes performed just as well or even slightly better than the larger V1L model in the very low-shot, like one-shot settings. Maybe the larger model is slightly overfitting or needs more examples to shine.
Huh. Okay. Now, the big test. Full fine-tuning. When you do have a decent amount of labeled data for a specific task, how does it stack up against the state-of-the-art then?
This is where they use the PanGA benchmark. It's a collection of diverse, challenging EO tasks, kind of the standard community benchmark now.
And the results?
Really strong. The base TerraMind V outperformed other existing geospatial foundation models by a noticeable margin, like 3% average accuracy improvement across the tasks.
Better than other foundation models. What about models built specifically for those tasks?
That's even more impressive. TerraMind seems to be the only foundation model reported so far that actually outperforms task-specific standard architectures, like UNets, across the PanGA benchmark on average, especially on tasks that benefit from multiple data types. It also beat specialized vision transformer baselines.
Wow, okay.
And the larger model, V1L, gave another couple of % boost on top of V1B. Plus, comparing V1B dual scale to V1B single, mostly token scale, clearly showed the benefit of using both pixel and token level inputs during pre-training. The dual scale approach definitely adds value.
So it's not just versatile. It's actually top tier in performance when fine-tuned. Now, let's revisit that thinking in modalities, or TIM. How does generating extra data during fine-tuning help?
The idea is you're giving the model extra relevant context while it's learning the main task. So if it's learning to map floods from radar and optical, you also ask it to predict the land cover map for that same area simultaneously.
Even if the prediction isn't perfect.
Exactly. Even a slightly imperfect, internally generated land cover map might give it useful clues. For example, knowing this area is usually farmland versus this area is usually a river could help it better interpret the radar signal when trying to spot floodwater.
And did it work in practice?
Yes, they showed results for flood mapping using the Senquan Floods 11 dataset, where using this TIM tuning strategy improved accuracy by up to 2% IOU, which is quite significant. They saw similar, though maybe slightly smaller, gains for a crop mapping task, too.
It's like giving the model an extra virtual sensor to consult.
Hmm.
Clever. Now, the paper's supplementary material apparently goes deep into the tokenizer performance.
Yeah.
Anything key stand out there?
Yeah, they provide a lot of detail. The tokenizers are critical, right? They found performance is sensitive to training details like learning rate and the vocabulary size. They also noted that while FSQ helps stability, maybe other quantization methods could potentially give slightly better image reconstruction if stability wasn't an issue.
Did they look at where the errors happen?
They did. Spatially, the reconstruction errors were generally low and evenly distributed. Although, maybe unsurprisingly, very bright snow or ice in optical images could sometimes be a bit trickier to reconstruct perfectly.
And what about the radar tokenizer? Radar data is notoriously noisy.
Good point. Radar has that speckle noise. They used specific metrics that look at image structure, like a SIM, and found the radar tokenizer performed very well, suggesting it captured the underlying information effectively despite the speckle. They did detailed analysis comparing original and reconstructed intensity values, too.
Okay. And the supplementary also had more any-to-any generation pictures.
Yes, just more visual examples showing it generating across all the different modalities. It reinforces the point that when you start with rich input, like good quality optical or radar, the generated outputs in other modalities look really good. If you start with something less informative, like maybe just the elevation, the generated images might have more noticeable artifacts. Quality in, quality out to some extent.
Right. And one last bit from the supplementaries, comparing TerraMind's generated land use data to existing labels.
Ah, yeah. They compared the LULC maps generated by TerraMind Zero Shot against established pseudo-labels from a project called Dynamic World, specifically for helping with flood mapping.
Yeah.
They found that while a fine-tuned TerraMind model beat the Dynamic World model for flood mapping, the LULC maps generated directly by the base TerraMind weren't quite as good as the specialized Dynamic World predictions for LULC itself.
Yeah.
Which makes sense. Dynamic World is built just for that one task.
Okay, got it. We've covered a huge amount of ground here. To try and wrap this up, what are the really key takeaways about TerraMind?
I think it boils down to a few things. One, it's pioneering this truly any-to-any generative capability for a wide range of EO data. That's a big conceptual leap. Two, the dual-scale pre-training seems really effective, learning rich representations that work well for zero-shot, few-shot, and fine-tuned tasks. Three, this thinking in modalities idea, using generated data as internal context, is a novel way to potentially boost performance further. And four, the proof is in the performance. It's setting a new state-of-the-art on challenging benchmarks like PanGEA, even beating specialized models.
So looking ahead, what's the potential impact here? What could models like TerraMind mean for how we understand and monitor the Earth?
I think the potential is massive. This ability to seamlessly integrate and even generate diverse data streams. It paves the way for future models that could handle even more complexity. Think multi-temporal data automatically, different resolutions fused together, maybe hyperspectral data folded in.
Filling in the gaps, basically.
Filling gaps, enhancing signals, maybe even predicting future states more accurately. Given how rich the Earth observation data ecosystem is becoming, AI like this could unlock enormous value for environmental monitoring, disaster response, agriculture, climate science, you name it.
So here's a final thought for you listening. Now that AI can not only analyze the flood of data we get from space, but can also start to imagine different data types, fill in observational gaps, maybe even simulate scenarios, what new kinds of questions can we actually ask about our planet? How might this change our fundamental understanding?
That's the exciting frontier, isn't it? It challenges us to think more creatively about leveraging these tools, not just for analysis, but perhaps for exploration and hypothesis testing in ways we couldn't before.
And if you do want to explore further, remember the team is open sourcing the TerraMind dataset, the models, the code. It's a fantastic chance to really get hands-on with what might be the next generation of Earth observation AI.